I never thought a single word could have such weight. But it did. That word was no. For 9 years I had been everything to everyone in my family. I had been the quiet backbone, the one who showed up no matter the weather, the one who baked the cakes, folded the laundry, lent the money, wiped the tears, and smoothed the tension. I had given freely, not because I was naive, but because I loved fiercely. I loved my children, my grandchildren, and yes, even my daughter-in-law, whose sharp words sometimes cut deeper than she realized. It began like so many long stories in small moments. My son Andrew had just been laid off. He was 26, newly married to Marissa, and expecting their first child. The apartment deposit needed to be made, or they would lose their place. I didn't hesitate. 6,000. Gone from my savings, but I didn't think twice. You don't hesitate for your children. The next year, his car broke down, a transmission that gave up on a rainy Thursday night while he was driving home from work. I sent $200 because who else would? Then came dental bills. Then the backyard fence for safety. Then birthday parties for grandchildren, who didn't have a yard big enough for even a simple piñata. And through it all, I never counted the costs. I never did. That wasn't the plug. I also gave in quiet, uncelebrated ways. I drove in the rain to pick up my grandson from school when one of them was stuck at work. I brought lemon cake every Sunday. I washed dishes late into the night, long after everyone else had gone home. I thought that these acts, small or large, were what being a good mother and grandmother meant. Yet, with every check I wrote, every casserole I carried, a quiet thought whispered in the back of my mind. What if they only love me because I give? I pushed it aside. Love, I told myself, was never conditional. Until that Tuesday in March. I was at the kitchen sink, rinsing the last of the breakfast dishes. Outside, the forsythia had begun to bloom. My hip ached in the damp morning, the dull reminder of my age and the years of work my body had carried. The phone rang. It was Andrew. "Mom," he said. No greeting. Just the word I had heard so many times since he was 16 and needed something. My stomach tightened. "We've been looking at this trip," he began. "Portugal, maybe southern Spain. 10 days and the kids would love it. Honestly, we need it. Things have been stressful. We're a little short, not a lot. Maybe 8,000. We'd pay you back by fall." $8,000. $8,000 for a vacation months before my hip surgery, before the pre-op appointments, before the recovery that would last longer than I hoped. I thought about my savings, quietly built for moments like this. My heart ached, but I said the words anyway. "I can't, Andrew. I have my hip surgery coming up in April. I need to keep my savings liquid through the summer. I'm sorry." There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough for something to shift. "Okay," he said flatly. "Got it." And he hung up. I stood at the sink for a long moment, staring at the swaying branches outside. I told myself it was fine. People get disappointed, that's allowed. But 4 hours later, the text came from Marissa. "We've been talking. And we think some space would be good for everyone. We won't be doing the usual Sunday dinners for a while." The words felt like a stone in my chest. Sunday dinners. 11 years of showing up without fail, driving 40 minutes through rain, snow, grief after my husband died, carrying potato salad, lemon cake, hand-knitted hats. Never once empty-handed. Never once asked for anything back. And now, for saying no to 8,000, I was suddenly someone who needed space. I sat on the edge of the bed with the half-folded laundry still in my hands. I tried not to cry, tried to reason that disappointment wasn't punishment. But inside, a storm was gathering. I lay awake that night, thinking through every dollar I had ever given them. The apartment deposit, the car repair, dental bills, the fence, school supplies, birthday parties, groceries every other week, pick-ups from school, every act, every sacrifice, quietly made without a tally or expectation. And now, one refusal, one necessary refusal, and the world as I knew it had shifted. I called Beverly, my friend of 35 years, who lived 3 houses down. She listened without interruption, the kind of listening that carried presence and love. "They really said space," she said. Because you couldn't lend money before your surgery, right? I nodded, though she couldn't see me. She didn't need to. Come over for coffee, she said. I've got that hazelnut you like. We sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours, talking about nothing and everything as old friends do. When I finally stood to leave, she put her hand on my arm. You know you didn't do anything wrong. And for the first time in years, I believed it. The next week I went to my attorney, Patricia Walsh, to update my will. I wanted to remove Andrew and Marissa as primary beneficiaries. I named my sister and Savannah instead. Someone who checked in without asking for anything. Someone who loved me simply because I existed. I also set up a small educational trust for my grandchildren, fully separate from my son and his wife. They would not have access to it. As I signed the documents, a weight lifted from my chest. Not celebration, not relief, but clarity. I was finally acting in accordance with what I actually knew to be true, instead of hoping what might still become true. The surgery went smoothly. I spent 4 days in rehab, then returned home to a house I had prepared meals in the freezer, bedroom arranged, numbers for emergencies by the phone. Beverly visited every other day, the perfect balance of company and space. 3 weeks later, a small card arrived, a mail from my grandson. Hand-drawn, a simple message: I miss you, Grandma. I hope your hip feels better. I made this for you. I placed it on the refrigerator. I didn't call immediately. I waited. Not from anger, but from a newfound steadiness. I would call from a place of choice, not fear or obligation. When I did, we laughed together, spoke about baseball lizards, and whether sharks could be considered dogs. My grandson's joy was infectious. I promised we would make pie crust together when I was better. I realized then that the family I had spent 9 years holding together was still fractured in some ways, but something had shifted. I was no longer defined by my availability, my money, or my ability to say yes. I had boundaries, dignity, and self-respect. And those were gifts I could give myself, regardless of how others responded. Weeks later, I booked a train to Savannah, one-way open return. My sister's back bedroom was ready. Shrimp and grits on the stove. Porch facing west, so I could watch the evening unfold, slow and warm. For the first time in years, I was not waiting for approval, not hoping for gratitude. I was simply here, alive, whole, and owning my life. And it was more than enough. The days after my surgery passed in a rhythm I had not known in years. No one was calling for last-minute favors, no one asking me to rearrange my life for them. The silence was heavy at first. A reminder of the absence of the people I had spent years serving. But gradually, it became a kind of quiet music, steady and reliable. I began noticing the little things in my house. The corners I had ignored while running from one obligation to the next. I found the book I had been meaning to read for months. The sunlight fell across the pages in long, golden streaks, and for the first time in years, I read without looking at the clock. I remembered my husband's love for stories. He had always said that a good book could take you somewhere, even if your body refused to move. I smiled quietly, thinking how true that was. The next week, I opened the box of old letters and notes from the years when my children were growing up. Handwritten reminders of victories, small victories, and tiny heartbreaks. I had kept them, like so many mothers do, not because I needed a record, but because they were pieces of a life that had been lived fully, and fiercely, and without regret. But now, in the quiet, I looked at them differently. They were not only memories. They were reminders of how much of myself I had given away in the name of love. I thought about Andrew and Marissa. I had never asked for repayment or recognition for the money I had sent, for the hours I had spent driving back and forth, for the meals I had prepared. I had done it because I loved them, and because I could. But now I saw it clearly. I had given so much of myself that I had lost sight of who I was when I wasn't giving. I had blurred the line between generosity and self-erasure. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I went through my financial records once more. It was almost ritualistic, a way of counting and remembering. Apartment deposits, Car repairs, dental bills, school supplies, birthday presents. I had never done this before, not in full view, not consciously. The total made my heart ache. 47,000 over 9 years. A staggering sum, and yet, it was only a fraction of what I had given in time, love, patience, and energy. I realized then that it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the life I had lived for others. And I didn't regret it. I only regretted not having recognized my own limits sooner. That recognition was the first true gift I gave myself. Beverly came over that afternoon, carrying her usual basket of gossip and homemade bread. We sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, and for the first time in years, I did not feel the tug of obligation. We laughed about trivial things, shared memories of our children's mischief, and spoke quietly about the years behind us. When she left, I felt lighter, as if a small but significant weight had lifted from my shoulders. That night, I wrote in my journal, something I had not done in decades. I wrote about fear. The fear of being unwanted, unloved, or unnecessary. I wrote about love, the kind that gives freely, and the kind that sets boundaries. I wrote about strength. About learning to say no without guilt, about discovering that my value was not contingent on my usefulness. And then I thought about the Sunday dinners. I had mourned them at first, the absence of routine, laughter, and the smell of roasting chicken in the oven. But in that morning, I also realized something vital. I had never truly belonged to myself during those years. I had been a caretaker, a provider, a fixer. Now there was space to belong to me. The next call from Andrew came unexpectedly. His voice was tight, hesitant, almost unfamiliar. "Mom, I know I handled things badly." He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't apologize fully. But it was closer than anything he had ever offered. And I listened, not with the urgency to forgive. Not with the pressure to explain or justify myself. But as someone who had grown into her own skin. We talked briefly, about nothing and everything. I told him I loved him and hoped he and the kids had a wonderful trip. And then I hung up. For the first time I felt no collapse afterward. No tremor of guilt. No hollow ache of self-blame. I had said what I needed to say and it was enough. Weeks later, a card arrived from my grandson. Hand-drawn. With uneven letters that wobbled across the page. "I miss you, Grandma. I hope your hip feels better. I made this for you." The pure, unconditional love of a child, untainted by expectation, reached me more profoundly than any thank you I had ever received from adults. I pinned it to the refrigerator, where I could see it every morning. As spring came in earnest, the irises bloomed along the back fence. I remembered planting them with my husband years ago, before illness took him from us. They came up faithful and strong every year, without me needing to tend them carefully. Some things, I thought, were reliable simply because they were built to last, not because someone forced them to grow. I began planning a trip to Savannah to visit my sister. One way, open return. I needed the distance, the space, the quiet affirmation of a family connection, not tied to obligation. I sorted through old toys, books, and keepsakes in my front closet. I left behind the sweaters Marissa had once admired, donating them quietly. I wanted to travel light, not just physically, but emotionally. On the train, as cities gave way to smaller towns and open fields, I let myself stretch out across the seat without apology. The scenery passed, green and vibrant with early spring. For the first time I was not waiting for someone else's validation. I was not waiting for forgiveness. I was simply existing in my own truth. And in that existence, I found freedom. The train rocked gently as it carried me south, the landscape unfolding like a story I hadn't read in years. Fields of green stretched endlessly, punctuated by small towns with porches and flowering dogwoods. I watched quietly, letting the rhythm of the train, and the hum of wheels on rails ease the tight coil of tension that had woven through my chest for months. For the first time in a long time, I felt unburdened, if only slightly. When I arrived in Savannah, my sister Margaret was waiting at the station. She hugged me as if I had been gone for years, even though it had only been months. There was no small talk, no hesitation, just a warm embrace, and the certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Her house smelled faintly of coffee and jasmine. She had the back bedroom prepared, as promised, with the mattress fluffed, fresh linens, and a small vase of flowers on the nightstand. The familiarity of her home, combined with her steady presence, felt like coming home after a long exile. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. Margaret made shrimp and grits that evening, and we ate slowly on the back porch, the golden light of sunset spilling across the wooden planks. We talked quietly, not about the drama with Andrew and Marissa, but about our childhood, our parents, and memories of long-forgotten summers. We laughed about shared secrets and quietly mourned the ones we had lost along the way. It was ordinary conversation, yet extraordinary in its relief. I realized then how much of my life I had been living in service to others, and how little I had allowed myself ordinary joy. That night, I sat on the porch alone, listening to the distant calls of birds settling in for the evening. The air smelled of salt and earth. I thought about Andrew, about Marissa, about my grandchildren. My heart ached for the bond that had been strained, but I also understood something new: love did not require self-erasure. It could coexist with boundaries. It could thrive even if I said no. The next morning, I walked through Margaret's garden, tracing the paths we had made together as children. The roses she had planted decades ago were still blooming, resilient and strong, much like the women in our family. I thought about my own garden at home, the irises, the bulbs my husband had planted, returning every spring regardless of care. Life had a way of continuing, of surviving, and sometimes thriving, without my constant intervention. I spent the days in Savannah slowly, deliberately, almost as a retreat from the life I had left behind. Margaret and I read on the porch, cooked meals together, and wandered through the historic streets, noticing the details we had ignored in the past. The ironwork on balconies, the moss-covered oaks, the tiny shops tucked between centuries-old buildings. For the first time I allowed myself to simply observe, to exist without a checklist or an obligation. One afternoon as we sipped tea on the porch, I finally spoke about Andrew. Not in anger, not in accusation, but in truth. I don't know if they will ever understand what they've lost by taking me for granted, I said softly. Margaret listened, nodding. They may never fully understand, she said. But you don't need their understanding to know your worth. You've carried too much. And now you're learning that it's okay to carry yourself first. Her words struck a chord deep within me. For years, I had defined myself through service, through giving. I had believed that my value was measured by my usefulness to others. Now, I realized that my worth was intrinsic, not conditional. The love I had for my family was still there, but it did not require me to sacrifice my health, my comfort, or my peace of mind. During my stay, I reflected on the countless times I had said yes, when I wanted to say no, and how often those yeses had been acts of fear disguised as love. Fear that if I didn't give, I wouldn't be loved. Fear that setting boundaries would mean rejection. Fear that my presence in my family's life depended entirely on my ability to provide, to fix, to serve. But now I felt the power of choice. I could say no and still be whole. I could love without losing myself. I could care without collapsing under the weight of expectation. It was a revelation both terrifying and liberating. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air cooled, I looked out over the river that wound through Savannah. I thought about my grandchildren, about the card from my grandson, and about the pie crust we would make together when I returned. I realized that my connection to them didn't require me to sacrifice my own well-being. Love, I now understood, could be both generous and self-respecting. By the time I returned home, my hip fully healed and my mind more at ease than it had been in years, I carried with me a quiet confidence. I had said no, and nothing had shattered me. I had reclaimed my time, my energy, my peace, and in doing so, I had given myself something far more valuable than any monetary gift ever could provide: the knowledge that I mattered, independent of anyone else's needs. And slowly, very slowly, my family began to respond, not in the way I had expected, with immediate gratitude or apologies, but with subtle shifts. A text from my daughter-in-law acknowledging the stress, a tentative phone call from Andrew checking in, a card from my grandson. They were small gestures, imperfect, but they were steps toward understanding that my presence was not something to be taken for granted. I had learned that saying no was not a rejection of love, it was an affirmation of it. A love that includes myself. And in that affirmation, I discovered freedom, resilience, and a quiet joy I had never known before. Returning home from Savannah was like stepping into a space I had never truly owned before. My house was quiet, yes, but no longer lonely. The irises along the back fence had sprouted in earnest, their delicate purple heads nodding in the breeze. I paused to admire them, letting their simple beauty anchor me in the present. For the first time, I felt a sense of home that belonged entirely to me. I unpacked slowly, taking each item from Savannah, the small gifts, the books, the quiet warmth of my sister's presence, and placing them carefully in my home. The sweater I had donated, the toys left behind, all of it was a symbolic shedding of the weight I had carried for years. I realized that I could keep loving without carrying everyone's burdens. A few days later, I received a message from my grandson. "Grandma, can we make the pie crust this weekend? I have my rolling pin ready." My heart leaped. I smiled as I read it, feeling a surge of anticipation, not tied to obligation. For the first time, I could meet him on equal footing, sharing a moment without sacrificing my well-being. That Saturday, I set out the ingredients on the kitchen counter. Sunlight streaming through the windows. My grandson bounded in, carrying his tiny apron, eyes wide with excitement. Together we measured flour, cracked eggs, and rolled dough. Flour dusting our hands in the countertop. He laughed when it stuck to his fingers. I laughed too, freely, the kind of laughter that comes from love and not from duty. As we worked, I realized something profound. I had spent years teaching, giving, and holding my family together, but these moments, these tiny, messy, delicious moments, were the ones that truly mattered. They were not transactions, not obligations, not proof of my usefulness. They were simply life, lived fully, and shared with love. Later that evening, I reflected on the past months. The pain of saying no, the silence, the initial hurt, it had all led to this. A deeper understanding of myself, my limits and my worth. I could give without losing myself, love without fear, and still be a grandmother, a mother, a sister, a friend. But most importantly, I could be me. Andrew called later that week. The conversation was tentative at first, but warmer than it had been in years. He asked about my hip, about the trip to Savannah, about the pie crust. I answered honestly, calmly, without a tremor of guilt. There was no lecture, no request, no expectation. Just conversation. And in that simplicity there was healing. Marissa sent a text as well, shorter this time, acknowledging that she had been stressed, and that she appreciated everything I had done for the family over the years. It wasn't a full apology, but it was an opening. A small door that I could choose to step through when I was ready. I felt no need to rush. My relationship with them was no longer dictated by fear or guilt, but by choice. As weeks turned into months, I continued to reclaim my life. I took long walks, tending to my own garden, reading, writing, and reconnecting with friends. Beverly visited frequently, bringing her warm presence and the quiet joy of companionship that was not contingent on obligation. Margaret called on her usual Sundays, sharing stories, laughter, and comfort. I began to document the life I had quietly lived for others, not for judgment or boasting, but as a testament to the lessons I had learned. The story of saying no, of reclaiming myself, of understanding that love does not require self-erasure. I wanted these lessons preserved, for myself, for my grandchildren, for anyone who might one day need the courage to set boundaries without shame. One afternoon, as I watered the irises, my grandson appeared at the back gate. "Grandma, come look," he called, breathless with excitement. Together, we explored the small wonders of the garden, buds opening, bees buzzing, the slow crawl of the snail along the garden path. I felt present in a way I hadn't in years. No worry, no guilt, no pressure. Only love, and the quiet affirmation of being here fully and entirely. And in those moments, I realized that saying no had not broken my family. It had reshaped it, clarified it, and allowed the true connections to surface. I had discovered that my presence mattered, not because I had given endlessly, but because I existed wholly, with boundaries, with love, and with the courage to stand firm. I wrote in my journal that I am enough. My love is enough. I can give freely without losing myself. I can say no without fear. I can exist fully, simply, wholly. And that existence is a gift to the world around me. The transformation was subtle and ongoing. There were no grand reconciliations, no sweeping apologies. But there was a shift, an understanding that I was no longer defined solely by what I gave or by the needs I fulfilled. I was defined by who I was, independent of their demands, and that truth brought a peace I had never known. Through the months, the relationship with my family evolved slowly. Small gestures of love and acknowledgement replaced the unspoken expectation of sacrifice. Sunday dinners eventually returned, not as a duty, but as a choice. And when they did, I participated with joy, not obligation, and with boundaries firmly in place. The pie crusts, the lemon cakes, the laughter, they became shared moments, not tests of my devotion. And in the quiet of my home, surrounded by flowers, memories, and the gentle love of those who truly mattered, I realized that my life had not been diminished by saying no, it had been enriched. By reclaiming myself, I had created space for love that was real, reciprocal, and enduring. For the first time in decades, I was not waiting for anyone's approval or permission. I was living my truth. And that truth, quietly and powerfully, was enough. The months that followed were gentle, deliberate, and transformative. I continued to nurture the small routines I had neglected for so long, tending to my garden, reading with deliberate focus, and spending time with friends who brought me laughter without expectation. I had learned to savor the ordinary, to let quiet moments carry weight not as obligations, but as affirmations of life well lived. My family, too, was learning. Not all at once, not perfectly, but with incremental awareness. Andrew began to check in without anxiety or pressure, asking about my health, my garden, my books. The tone of his messages changed gradually, from guilt-laden requests to genuine curiosity and care. Marissa's texts, initially terse, began to carry warmth, and eventually, she sent photos of the children enjoying school projects, birthdays, and small victories. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Acknowledgement without entitlement. One Saturday morning, I received a small envelope in the mail. Inside, a note from my grandson, written with careful, deliberate letters. Grandma, I made cookies today. I wanted to share them with you. Can I come over? There were crumbs pressed into the edges. A tiny paw print of flour where he had held the paper. My heart swelled. I responded with a note of my own. Yes. Come when you like. We'll bake together. And maybe you can teach me something new too. That afternoon he arrived carrying a mixing bowl and a grin wider than I had ever seen. We baked cookies, spilling flour across the counter, laughing at the mess, sharing stories of school and friends. And in that mess, I realized the profound truth I had been learning. Love did not require sacrifice. Love thrived in mutual respect, shared joy, and presence. I could give fully, but not at the cost of myself. I also began to see the long-term fruits of saying no, not as punishment, but as a redirection. With the trust I had set up for my grandchildren, I could ensure that their education and well-being were protected, independent of my son and daughter-in-law's choices. It was not about control. It was about ensuring that love and care continued where it was most needed, safely and wisely. Beverly and Margaret continued to anchor me. Their voices, laughter, and steady presence reminded me that family and friendship were not measured solely by obligation. They were measured by choice, care, and the consistency of presence. Even when life was messy, the Sunday dinners eventually returned, but they were different now. I no longer arrived with anxiety, worrying that my absence would fracture the fragile bonds I had spent years maintaining. Instead, I arrived with intention, choosing joy, and with the freedom to step back when I needed. The lemon cake I once baked out of routine became a ritual of connection, not of sacrifice. The potato salad and the handmade hats were tokens of love, not proof of worth. I reflected on the lessons I had learned. Saying no had been terrifying, but necessary. It had been punished initially, with silence and absence, but ultimately it had clarified what truly mattered. The relationships that were meant to endure had deepened. Those that were conditional had either adjusted or faded. I had discovered the power of boundaries, the strength of self-respect, and the freedom that comes from honoring your own life. In quiet moments, I would sit in my garden, watching the irises sway in the breeze, the sunlight spilling across petals and leaves. I would read, write, or simply breathe, letting the life I had chosen unfold around me. I thought of my husband, of my children, of my grandchildren, and of myself. I had loved fiercely, but I had also learned to live fiercely. And that, I realized, was the true gift. One evening, as the sky blushed with the colors of sunset, I called Andrew. "Grandma, can we talk?" His voice was softer than it had ever been. I smiled, hearing the tentative warmth in his tone. "Of course," I said. We spoke for an hour now, not about obligations, not about past grievances, but about life, hopes, dreams, and the small joys that made it bearable. The conversation ended with laughter, understanding, and a mutual recognition of love. I hung up the phone and looked around my home. The card from my grandson still hung on the refrigerator. The irises outside nodded gently in the evening breeze. My house, my space, my life, it was no longer a stage for obligation, but a sanctuary for love, choice, and freedom. In that quiet, I understood fully what saying no had given me. Not just boundaries, but presence, not just freedom, but authenticity, not just relief, but empowerment. I had lived for others for years, and in doing so, I had nearly lost myself. Now I had returned to myself. Strong. Enough. And for the first time in decades, I could say, with certainty and peace, I am enough. I am loved. I am free. The story of those 9 years, the cost of saying yes too often, and the courage of finally saying no, would remain with me forever. It was a testament to the strength of self, the complexity of love, and the quiet power of choice. And in that quiet power, I found everything I had ever truly needed.